I am a taxi driver for night workers. Horror story. Good evening, community. My name is Salvador, and I am currently 55 years old. The story I am about to tell you happened years ago when I worked as a taxi driver. I won't deny that it had its positive and negative aspects. Generally, I enjoyed what I did. I liked talking to my passengers, entering their lives for a few minutes, and enjoying a good conversation. I started like any other taxi driver, picking up people to move around the city. I worked for a known company for several years until I had the opportunity to buy my own vehicle. Having my own car made things much better. My schedule was more flexible. At that time, I only rented the license plate and paid a weekly fee. What I liked most about my job was the freedom it gave me. I enjoyed driving, and the municipality where I worked was not very big, so I rarely got stuck in traffic. I didn't make much money, but it was more than enough. By that time, I was no longer with my wife, but I always took care of my son's expenses. He was 8 years old at the time. As a divorced man, I wasn't very demanding. I simply bought the essentials, and that was enough for me. One afternoon, while I was at the taxi stand, one of my colleagues approached me. He said he had something to propose to me. Intrigued, I asked him what it was. We walked to the side, and he told me that he had been offered a job at a bar. It had been open in the municipality for some time. He mentioned the name, and I laughed, telling him that it wasn't a bar, but rather a brothel. You know, a place where many lonely men go to clear their minds for a while. He told me a bit about the job. They were looking for a private taxi driver, someone who would mainly work at night. The idea seemed attractive to me. It was a secure job. Curiously, I asked him why he hadn't taken the offer. He mentioned that he had his wife at home, and she probably wouldn't approve. Jose was 15 years older than me, and he thought of me for the position. He trusted my honesty and had known me for years. It was a good opportunity to earn extra money. Although I found the proposal amusing, I didn't plan on taking the job at that moment. I was simply curious. The next day, I spoke with the owner, Nestor. We agreed to meet that same afternoon. I was surprised by how young he was, not older than 30. He explained his idea and the service he wanted to offer. Lately, there had been customers asking for taxis or other means of transportation to get home. He didn't have anything to offer them, and sometimes it was difficult to find transportation in the early hours of the morning. For now, he only wanted to try with one vehicle and see how it worked. If things went well, he planned to hire 2 or 3 more. The man spoke with confidence and determination. He seemed to know how to run a business, and that gave me a lot of confidence. We discussed the working hours and the percentage of earnings that each of us would receive. The income was very interesting, and the job was safe and easy. As I mentioned before, my intention was only to gather information about the job, but I ended up accepting that same afternoon. That's how I started my first days as a taxi driver for night workers. Although, to be honest, I transported all kinds of people, not just them. The place was located on the outskirts of the city, like other similar establishments. It was a bit secluded but still accessible to anyone interested. Thanks to its location, there were many local customers, as well as people from neighboring towns. Some had their own cars, while others preferred to be more discreet and arrived in taxis. The vehicle I used didn't look like a typical taxi. It was simply a black car, trying to appear as normal and anonymous as possible. During the years I worked there, I had the opportunity to experience many things. Some were interesting, others unpleasant, and there were also a few inconveniences, mainly with some of the clients who were infatuated with the bar's workers. But that's a story for another time. Today, I will focus on one of the most frequent customers of that place. Let's call him Don Bruno. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary man, nothing out of the ordinary. However, people in the bar talked about him in a not-so-positive way. Don Bruno was around 50 years old and had a lot of money. He was a friend of the owner and a very frequent visitor to the bar. I didn't know if he was visiting someone specific, but according to what I had heard, he had his favorite. To be honest, Don Bruno was a man who aged gracefully. He maintained a good figure thanks to his work. He had a pronounced beard and always smiled. The man knew which days we had fewer customers, and those were the days he would visit. Most of the time, he came in his own van, and sometimes he had a driver. But I remember a few times when I had to drive him home. His house was a ranch located about an hour and a half away, towards the mountains. The first time I drove him, I was a bit scared. It was known that the mountains in the municipality were dangerous, especially during those late hours. I wasn't eager to make the trip with him. However, my boss insisted and told me that the man had money and always left good tips for the workers. I didn't think much about it, and frankly, I didn't have many options. I will admit that I was afraid the entire way. It turned out that the man was very pleasant. It was the first time I drove him, and at first sight and by the way he spoke, he seemed like a country man. He was very attentive and cheerful, talking about his land during the whole journey. When we arrived at his house, I was amazed. It was huge and very modern. I didn't go inside, but just by looking at the facade, I confirmed why people said the man was wealthy. That night, he left me a very generous tip. Shortly after, I heard other things about him. One of the most talked about among the workers was that Don Bruno had made a pact with the devil. At first, I didn't believe it. The man didn't give off that impression at all. He seemed like a simple country person, nothing more. One night, my boss asked me to drive Don Bruno home again. It was the third time, so I felt more confident. Besides, I knew I would earn some extra money. However, this time was different. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by one of the bar's workers. It was very uncommon for clients to take the girls out. It happened very rarely, mostly with those who had money, as the bar owner always liked to keep them happy. And he knew they were not in much danger, or at least that's what he thought. It was around 1 and I remember there weren't many people at the bar that night. The place was calm. Both of them got into my car, and we started the journey. The first thing I noticed was that they seemed a bit drunk. Julia, that's what we'll call the woman, was around 20 years old. I won't deny that she was very beautiful, with her dark skin and light brown eyes. She greeted me and sat in the back seat next to Bruno. They talked for a while, and then they started kissing. Within a few minutes, we were already far from the municipality, driving on the national highway. Then, we turned onto a dirt road that led directly to Bruno's ranch. The road passed through a few small towns. Bruno was telling the woman about his ranch, talking a lot about his cattle and animals. As I mentioned before, he was a very simple person. At that moment, I heard the woman ask him if it was true what they said about him. Bruno, laughing, replied that there were many things people said about him in the town. Some could be true, while others were simply garbage. There was silence, and then the woman kissed him. They say you have a pact. That's why you can have whatever you want, whenever you want, she said. Bruno started laughing. I looked at him through the rearview mirror. He was looking out the window, still smiling. And what do you think? Is it true? He asked the woman. She laughed and replied that she didn't know. That's why she was asking. We were almost halfway there. I knew because we had just crossed a bridge over a river. Do you want me to show you something? Bruno asked. The woman, not quite sure, asked him what he meant. He asked if she wanted to find out if what they said about him was true. Once again, Julia laughed and said she didn't believe in those things and didn't think someone like him would be involved in them. Bruno, a bit more serious this time, repeated the question. The woman, in a mocking and challenging tone, said yes, she wanted him to show her. At that moment, Bruno asked me to stop the car. I thought he was joking, so I didn't pay much attention. But he repeated the order calmly and with a smile on his face. I told him there was no problem and stopped the car. Bruno asked the woman what she wanted to see or how she wanted him to show her. The woman, now a bit more serious after thinking for a few seconds, said she wasn't sure, just something that would prove he had a pact. No one said anything else. There was only darkness and silence around us. The only light illuminating the rest of the road came from the car's headlights. There was a few seconds of silence. I started to feel nervous and uncomfortable. I began to sense that something was outside the car. The woman laughed again, and I assumed she was quite drunk. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow pass right in front of the car. It was very quick. I stayed silent. Then, I heard what sounded like someone tapping on my window. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. The woman started laughing again, saying that it could have easily been me who made that noise. I felt a chill run down my spine. Another tap, but this time on the passenger window. I looked in that direction, and obviously, there was no one there, just darkness between the trees. The sound was similar to when someone taps their fingers on the glass. A thud shook the car as if something had hit it with great force. I felt a knot in my throat. I looked in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing, just the road disappearing into the night. I started to feel very nervous, as if my body was falling apart. "Are you sure you want to see it?" Don Bruno asked the woman. She didn't say anything else. Both of us were silent. There was no one around us, just trees and darkness. The only sounds were the laughter of Don Bruno, which caught us by surprise, interrupting the silence. Then, in a very calm tone, he told me to continue driving. I looked at his face through the rearview mirror. The man was very calm, a little confused by what had just happened. I decided to turn on the car, but when I looked ahead, I froze. There was someone standing in front of us. I felt terror take hold of me. You probably know St. Jude, a saint adored by many people. Well, what was standing in front of us was dressed like him. My heart was pounding rapidly. It was a man wearing a green cloak, and he even had a staff in his hand. But what made my hands tremble was his face. The car's light illuminated it completely. It was completely deformed. I can't explain it, but his mouth was very large, wide open, and his eyes were droopy, like those of a melted plastic doll. I felt a horrible weight on my shoulders, and my heart was racing uncontrollably. It was like a mockery. I saw St. Jude for a few seconds, and that was enough for me to look away, towards another direction. But it wasn't enough, and I had to close my eyes. That couldn't be anything good. I felt my eyes welling up with tears. A horrible feeling of helplessness overwhelmed me. Again, I heard a knock on the window, but this time on the other side, the passenger's side. I looked in that direction, and obviously, there was no one there, just darkness between the trees. The sound was similar to when someone taps their fingers on the glass. A thud shook the car as if something had hit it with great force. I felt a knot in my throat. I looked in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing, just the road disappearing into the night. I started to feel very nervous, as if my body was falling apart. "Are you sure you want to see it?" Don Bruno asked the woman. She didn't say anything else. Both of us were silent. There was no one around us, just trees and darkness. The only sounds were the laughter of Don Bruno, which caught us by surprise, interrupting the silence. Then, in a very calm tone, he told me to continue driving. I looked at his face through the rearview mirror. The man was very calm, a little confused by what had just happened. I decided to turn on the car, but when I looked ahead, I froze. There was someone standing in front of us. I felt terror take hold of me. You probably know St. Jude, a saint adored by many people. Well, what was standing in front of us was dressed like him. My heart was pounding rapidly. It was a man wearing a green cloak, and he even had a staff in his hand. But what made my hands tremble was his face. The car's light illuminated it completely. It was completely deformed. I can't explain it, but his mouth was very large, wide open, and his eyes were droopy. I am a taxi driver for Night Workers Horror Story. I heard it as clear as if it were very close to me. I held my canvas painting in my hands, pressing it tightly. My heart was beating very fast. I was just turning the corner to enter the kitchen when suddenly the voice disappeared. I searched the whole house, even went out to the garden, but I was completely alone. The sounds were driving me crazy, but my mind told me that I preferred that to seeing it again. I remembered the face of the specter standing in front of me that night, and terror invaded me. Despite seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, I was grateful that it didn't go beyond that. That same afternoon, just as I had just finished taking a shower, I heard the same thing. First, the voice of a girl, then she started singing. The melody was strange, a combination that made you instantly uncomfortable. I turned off the shower to listen better. I didn't leave the bathroom, but once again, I could hear the melody moving throughout the house. It was as if it was everywhere. I repeated Bruno's words to myself, saying out loud that it would soon go away, that it was just a matter of time for that thing to leave me alone. Leaving the bathroom, I went to buy a candle. I took out the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe that I had in my wallet and started praying. I was very scared. I asked her to protect me, to not let me see that thing again. And although I don't believe it to this day, it disappeared overnight. If you are enjoying the story, don't hesitate to subscribe. This helps us reach more people. We will continue next time. The next time I saw Don Bruno, several days had passed. I remember the man greeted me with a big smile before entering the bar. He asked me how I was, and I tried not to sound nervous as I told him I was fine, although I'm sure he noticed something strange in my voice. The man stayed at the bar for a while. I was hoping with all my soul that someone would come to pick him up and that it wouldn't be my turn to take him home. But luck was not on my side that night. My boss asked me to take the man to his ranch, and as I mentioned before, I had made that trip with him on other occasions. But since what had happened, I tried not to get too close to Don Bruno. I was afraid, not so much of him as a person, but more than anything, of everything that surrounded him, of what I had experienced the last time he left the bar. He smiled at me again when he left the bar, gave me a hug, and asked how I was. He got in the car, sat next to me, and we started our journey. Bruno was as cheerful as always, with his calm voice that characterized him. If someone had told me that this man had a pact with some astral being, I wouldn't have believed it. We entered the detour where the road was only dirt. Until that moment, I hadn't said anything. I kept silent, feeling somewhat nervous. Although, to be honest, I didn't feel that uncomfortable heaviness on my shoulders. "Is it leaving you alone now?" the man asked, breaking the silence. My hands were still on the steering wheel, my attention on the road. I knew what he was referring to, but I didn't say anything, just nodded. I had many questions, but I didn't know how to ask them. I also wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what was happening in that man's life, what that thing was. "What is it?" I asked when I turned my face towards him. There was a few seconds of silence. "It's my guardian angel," Don Bruno replied in a soft tone. I didn't understand. The image I always had of guardian angels was not like that. That thing was far from it. "Don't rack your brain trying to understand. You won't find an explanation," the man added. I asked him why I could see it and not Julia, if she was the one who wanted to. Bruno responded that it was even a mystery to him. He didn't know. There are simply certain people who can see it and others who can't. The way he referred to it sent a shiver down my spine. I confided in him and told him that I was very scared that night. I had never experienced anything like it in my life. The man asked me how it had manifested itself to me. I told him that it was dressed like St. Jude Thaddeus, but it was like a joke. Its face was deformed. Bruno fell silent for a while. I was afraid to ask him the question, but I still did. "How does it manifest itself to you? What does it look like?" I turned my face towards the man. He had his attention on the road. This time, he wasn't smiling. He just seemed thoughtful. He didn't answer my question, and I didn't insist. "The good thing is that you can be at peace now. It won't bother you anymore," Bruno added, placing his hand on my leg for a few seconds. I thought again about what he had told me, that it was his guardian angel. Doubting, I asked him if that thing was always with him. He replied that it was with him all the time, never leaving him. At that moment, I felt as if his voice was breaking. Then he looked in the rearview mirror. Once again, terror invaded my body. The idea that that thing was sitting in the back seat made me very nervous. Don Bruno changed the subject. I didn't want to insist and bring up the topic again, so I simply tried not to think about what might be accompanying us that early morning. When I dropped him off at his ranch, the man gave me a very tight hug, smiled at me, and told me to take care. I stayed parked in front of his house for a few minutes, thinking about what we had talked about. In my mind, I had many ideas, trying to understand what had led him to approach that thing. I couldn't imagine a life like that, with that thing following me everywhere, observing every move. A shiver ran through my body. Suddenly, the heaviness took hold of me again. I quickly started my car and took my way back. Over the years, rumors about Don Bruno continued to circulate. There were other people who had had strange experiences with him. Some even said that he wasn't as good as he seemed.